Now, the global debt crisis, what's at stake? Flashback a year or so, and Europe's debt crisis was arguably at its peak, and it's a crisis, I think, that we have not entirely recovered from today. Fast forward to 2013, have a glimpse at what's going on in Washington, D.C. today, and worries about a debt default in what could be a week's time. And add to that that we have growing worries in China about growing piles of debt, which arguably could as well become a big problem. With those ideas in mind, it's time to think about the financial system, and it's my pleasure to introduce Prime Minister de Villepin, former French Prime Minister, sometimes referred to as the Poet Prime Minister because of his love for poetry, and also former French Foreign Minister and a career diplomat. I think Monsieur de Villepin also makes quite a few trips through Hong Kong, as his son is based here, so we'll be happy to see him through Asia quite frequently, and we look forward to hearing your view on debt and the debt crisis. Prime Minister.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Let me first say how happy I am to be here with you in this foreign correspondent club. How happy I am also to have the opportunity to share with you some thoughts about the current international financial situation. What is at stake with the global debt? To make it short, it's about the change of the world. It's about how to wield and how to share power. And to put it a little more bluntly, it's about how the West has used its historical privileges to put the whole world's stability at risk. Don't worry, it's just a truck full of dynamite heading right towards us. What are the three privileges of the West? The first privilege is the control of currency. Since we abandoned the gold exchange standard of Bretton Woods, the dollar has become the true currency of world exchanges. And those who have the power to decide the value of the dollar decided to take advantage of it in favor of one single sovereign state, and of course, the United States. That's what the Fed called the benign neglect. What is the link, you may ask, with the debt? Just look at the figures. Since the dollar chose to let its exchange rate float, America has accumulated its huge double deficit. It has become the great debtor of the world, but without having to pay back the monthly payments any household would have. The American people have become the consumer in last resort, importing massively goods from Japan, then later from Korea, and now from China. Meanwhile, Washington financed its policies on debt, and we are still witnessing the consequences of this. Every year or so, the Congress has to raise the debt ceiling. Profits don't grow to the sky, but debt ceilings seems to do so. Mid-October, after weeks of shutdown of the American administration, there will be one more episode of this political soap opera with the vote of the ceiling of the debt. There is a second privilege. It is the control of the rules. It's much easier to win a game when you are the one deciding which are the rules. And in fact, it's even easier if you can change the rules during the game time, according to your needs. That's exactly what the Western power has done in the last centuries. The Opium Wars, the breakup of China, the British Raj in India, Africa torn between European countries in some cold room in Berlin in 1885, that's one side of it. But it has still been true in world finance over the 30 last years. Remember the Washington Consensus, Remember the adjustment plans that were imposed on developing countries. They created social and economic chaos just because the rules that could have worked maybe in Western countries had to be exactly the same in other places. And when you think of the social, economic, political catastrophe, the fast-track liberalization in Russia has been after the end of the Cold War, you have to ask yourself who these rules were made for. There is a third privilege. It is the control of the risks. It decides what the Western world decides what's risky and what is not. That to say, it decides where the money should go and where not. To say it even more bluntly, that's a way to redirect money towards projects in the West by under-evaluating the risk of default in Western countries and over-evaluating them in China, in India, in Brazil, in Pakistan. How comes they can do this? Because they do master the rules. And mainly because all the big three rating agencies who control the risk are Americans, or almost. 96% of the market of credit rating is in their hands. In a time when money becomes scarce, that's a huge advantage. The economic crisis is the beginning of a worldwide revolution. It is the beginning of the end of these privileges. They have become unacceptable in our world, and that's the whole meaning of the crisis of 2008. The crisis of 2007 and 2008 was before all a crisis of debt. We run into the wall of time. For 2 centuries, we have been buying ourselves a future through credit. More and more, we have been buying ourselves a present through credit. That's how the debt bubbles exploded everywhere. First, we have seen the dangerous burst of private debt. In many countries in the last 30 years, economic growth was artificially curbed by cheap credit. Since the 1970s, in many industrialized countries, low interest rates made credit easy, and low consideration for the risk of default was facilitated by the massive use of structured financial products. That's how the mortgage bubbles in the US, in the UK, or in Spain were blown up. And how did we respond to this crisis? The Fed flooded the market with liquidities. And in a way, the European Central Bank did the same a few years later. The quantitative easing programs may have been justified in the short run, but I am convinced they are in a danger in the long run. Instead of multiple limited bubbles, they have created, in fact, a giant worldwide bubble, betting that the world will be able to absorb it. The dangerous burst of corporate debt has been the second symptom of the global debt disease. For 30 years also, a new financial model has dominated the corporate growth through credit in the form of leveraged buyout or increase in capital yield by reducing the basis of capital through massive loans. The result has been to fragilize whole industries and even among the most efficient firms. We need to invent a more steady form of capitalization for the industry, more open to innovation, to entrepreneurship, by extending the role and scope of the obligatory market. The dangerous burst of public debt has been the third symptom. The global public debt alone do represent 50,000 billion US dollars. We seem to be back at the edge of default. We thought we had overcome this with the modern states. From the 16th to the 19th century, states were unpredictable. Austria defaulted 10 times. France, in the time of the kings, 8 times. We seem to be back to the times of the Great Depression, when many of the major states were buried under a heap of debts they could not pay back. In whole, the global debt represents over 200,000 billion US dollars. That's to say over 3 times the world's yearly output. And I must say, this is not something I discovered after I left office as Prime Minister of France, like so many. It's something I have always advocated, and under my government, debt was reduced in a way it had not been in 40 years. Between 2005 and 2007, with Thierry Breton as Minister of Finance, we reduced deficit, we reduced debt, we reduced public spending, we reduced taxes and unemployment, and we have increased growth. And if we wanted, we could also count immaterial debt, like the future cost of our impact on the climate change. But of course, this would bring us too far for today's discussion. But why did the private, corporate, and public debts of the West become unsustainable? They had piled up for so many years. Why not they should last some years more? For 30 years, the conditions of a worldwide confrontation have been prepared in the West and in the emerging world. On one side of the world, we had the madness of Western finance to meet the growing needs of economies with slower and lower returns. The financial system, with the complicity of the different states, has invented mechanisms that allow to attract even greater quantities of money. That's how mortgages were granted to households with almost no consideration for risk. Deregulation and derivative products have anesthesiated the economy. The insensitivity to risk became an addiction to risk. On the other side of the world, the new emerging powers saw their growth model based on exports was reaching its limits too. The exchanges with the West created more and more imbalances on both sides. The high increase in export to Western countries created an hemorrhage of currency, of factories, and also of jobs. In the emerging countries, it created bubbles and inequalities. The beginning rise in wages weakened the competitive advantages in an export-driven model. Around 2007, there were 3 changes that made confrontation inevitable. They happened in the emerging countries. First, it was a new control over the liquidities. Through the accumulated exports, the emerging countries were now controlling large part of the world's financial resources through currency exchange reserves of thousands of billions of dollars, through sovereign funds controlling today over $5,000 billion. Second change, there was a new need for commodities that had their prices skyrocket. This created a conflict for the appropriation of commodities, particularly in the energy sector, but it also created a new geography of wealth and resources that favored new actors like Russia, rising again from its ashes, for example, but it's true also in Indonesia, it's true in Peru, in South Africa. It created the conditions of a second emergence. The third change, the emerging countries needed a new growth model based no longer only on exported manufactured goods, but on the development of their inner market. This meant massive needs in credit to develop the country, particularly in the matters of infrastructures. There were no longer a single engine for world growth controlled by the West. There were now new engines igniting an autonomous growth in some parts of the world, and mostly China. The result of these changes was that the emerging countries needed more and more credit. This created an unprecedented competition for credit in today's world. Credit has become the stake of a worldwide competition. Credit has become an issue of standardization and fair common rules for all. Credit has become the key to the central nervous system of the new world's economy. Those who control credit do control the economy. Those who control risk control the credit. And those who control information do control risk. How did the West react? By clinging to the control of credit through its old privileges, making them even more dangerous as they already were. The quantitative easing policies decided by the Fed flooded the markets with fictitious money, maintaining the US economy afloat on oxygen pumps. The banking reform in the United States and in Europe, with its tightened rules, had mainly created a club of well-behaved aristocracy and thus benefited the restoration of the banking empire in London and New York, leaving on the side China, Russia, and other important actors on the new banking scenes. The continuing public deficits of Western countries were financed through cheap credit based on the aversion of risk. So basically, when it comes to build a new architecture for the world finance and economy, the bottom line has to be the reform of credit. The solutions won't come from America or from the West. They will come from the world, and we need principles to build upon. The first principle, we need diversity. We lived in a financial system where ideology has dominated without even knowing it. American standards, in the disguise of orthodoxy, have tried to apply mechanically to all the situations. It simply doesn't work. Judging emerging markets, their potentials, their resources, their political system through the eyes of ideology is being certain to be always at least half wrong. In the emerging worlds, no center of power can impose its ideology anymore. But that's not enough to create diversity. You have to want it, and you have to cultivate it. If you don't take the risk, you take the risk of a collapse of globalization in a few autarkic regions. This would be a setback for the whole world. The second principle, we need confidence. The whole crisis of 2008 has been the result of a breach in trust. There was no way anymore to know your partner. We had been shut off in the dark, and in the dark, you become afraid of one another. That's how almost all lending and borrowing was suspended. What did you do in the dark? Well, I believe you got to get talking to each other again, and someone has to introduce the talking so everyone gets to speak up. That's the role of a very new kind of actors on the financial markets, I would say. The third principle, we need responsibility. How could we accept a world where those who create the greatest instability are always too big to fail? There is no freedom, be it political or economic, without responsibility. But this means finding the appropriate courts and arbitrage to recognize the responsibility and to correct the inequities. We need a new multilateral approach to financial issues. Financial stability is a public good. It belongs to all people of the world. We need new global institutions, able to cope with the emergency and the complexity of our new world. It implies unprecedented ways of decision-making. The G20 has not proven tough enough. I believe the United Nations can be revived as a common forum of humanity by centering its activities on the economic development and financial stability of the world. In 1944-1945, San Francisco and Bretton Woods were two sides of the same coin. There needs to be more and better political guidance for the multilateral financial tools, the IMF and the World Bank. This should be done through an Economic Security Council that should deal specifically with these issues. We need also global regulations concerning all the public goods, stability of the exchange system, climate, oceanic resources. All these are public goods that cannot be left over only to the forces of market. A discussion must happen to confront points of view and to find a harmonious settlement of contradictions. We also need a new currency exchange system to resolve worldwide imbalances. I strongly believe that it is not sound if one currency, the dollar or any other, becomes the hegemonic currency because there is an obvious conflict of interest between the objectives of the nation controlling the currency and the needs of the world using it. Today, with globalization, the hegemony of the dollar is dwindling, and there will be no alternative currency. But I believe we can enter the age of multipolar currencies through a new Bretton Woods agreement for more worldwide stability. I believe we can have a common world currency, a counting unit calculated on the composed exchange rates of a basket of major currencies, the dollar, euro, the yuan, the yen. We have also to create the tools that will vouch for a more balanced circulation of credit around the world. The first key is a new investor type. The banking system that has failed in 2008 was a system with no limits, with no rules, with no controls. The speculative funds based on the highest possible immediate yield have created an economy literally without future, an economy of greed that thinks you should get all you can get today. I'm convinced this can change with a new type of investors. This can change with sovereign funds. They have their flows too, of course, but they also have one quality. They have time. Their main concern is tomorrow. The sovereign funds in the Arab world are there to compensate tomorrow's losses when the oil rigs go dry. The sovereign funds of exporting countries like China are concerned with creating new revenues and developing a strategy abroad for China based on investment more than exports. These new actors are already there, but they need a place in this order at the height of their new role. The second key, in my view, is to develop new global project bonds that will allow to connect again the virtual realm of finance with the reality of day-to-day economy. The industrialization process was a success because massive quantities of money could be invested easily in new types of anonymous shareholder companies. Today, we need a financially backed and worldwide crowdfunding of precise infrastructure or research projects that can promise returns only in the long run, but also promise changes of civilization that would, without them, become impossible. The third key is the role of credit rating agencies. And this issue is particularly important because, on this regard, we can act immediately. The three big agencies failed in their mission in 2007 and 2008 because of their methodologies, sometimes because of their conflict of interest. But most of all, they failed because they represented a world that was about to disappear. They represented the 30 years of financial deregulation. It's not by chance that 30 years ago, the profitability of the credit rating agencies began to rise steeply. They became part of the credit system itself, remunerated on commissions, encouraging speculative products like CDS. I'd like to stress and to show what can be made on this third point, credit rating agencies. Credit rating is not only about statistics. It's about investigation, information, intelligence. It's about an understanding of the world. It's not by chance that the first credit rating agency was founded in France by an ex-convict and policeman in the times of Napoleon, the famous and adventurous Vidocq. Today, we need new actors on the stage. They have to embody and make concrete the three principles I mentioned: diversity, confidence, and responsibility. Each of these principles is a challenge to create the new international system. How do we create new actors adapted to the diversity of the world? We do by taking up the challenge of cooperation. We don't need an alternative hegemony. We need a partnership in which all remain equal, but in which all take profit from aligning their forces. Who would not agree to say that when a war is to be fought, a society must unite and overcome its divisions? That's what history has taught us in Europe many times already. That's why I like to mention a specific project that seems particularly interesting to me, that is called Universal Credit Rating Group. It's new because it's not a sovereign-owned credit rating agency that wants to conquer the world. It's a worldwide alliance of credit rating agencies putting in common their energy and their diversity. It will be the first worldwide group based in the Asia Pacific, based in Hong Kong. We must solve the issue of a double bind, being altogether a worldwide actor and at the same time entangled in national sovereign mentalities and issues. And the big three companies can buy as many local partners as they want. It still will be the hegemony. As Mr. Guan Jianzhong, the president of Dagon, has put it, the system as it exists cannot go on. We can't wait for American initiatives to reform it. We must invent new actors capable of creating more confidence. That means accepting the challenge of independence. You are credible when you are independent. Independent from ideology, independent from a single financial interest, independent from single sovereign interest. But we also need new actors to give the system more simplicity. How can credit rating agencies do that? By relying on more objectivity. It's not sound when the main credit rating agencies depend on about 50% of subjective criteria. And I'm sure there are new criteria about to be developed. That's what UCRG has been advocating for, the logic of a double rating. That's a new outlook of globalization in which what matters is always, altogether, global and local. You can't see the real shape of things with only one eye. You need two eyes. It's difficult to walk only with just one leg. It's the same here. You need a local rating and you need a global rating.
Prime Minister, I don't want to cut
I'm
you
finishing.
off too abruptly.
I'm finishing.
I would like to make sure we get time for question and answers.
Of course. To have a full view of the realities of a corporation, of a sovereign debt, we need both eyes. UCRG is also different because it wants to stop painting the economy in black and white. It wants a new rating with more nuances, able to draw a better picture. I think this is a major change. You can choose party politics and choose to shut down the American federal services because you can't agree with people from the other party. This means, like in Europe, becoming incapable of taking any difficult decision because you depend on day-to-day media, polls, PR, advice, spin doctors, and whatever else. You can choose another way of doing it by creating association or new enterprises or new idea. And that's how, little by little, you respond with pragmatic ideals to the current situation. I believe in this project because we have to take the lesson of the past financial crisis. If we do not want to go through new crises, even more dangerous crises, we need to accept important changes. Unfortunately, I don't see Europe and I don't see the US learning very quickly from their errors. We have to speed up, and that's why I have accepted to be the chairman of the new advisory board of UCRG. There is a race going on in the world of finance, and until now, my finance has been running ahead. That's why it's so important to rise up to the challenge of innovation, to the challenge of fairness, to the challenge of a more balanced world where there is room for the prosperity of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. you very much. We have about 10 minutes. I just want to emphasize we do have a group of students from Hong Kong U Journalism School today. Do feel free to raise your hands and ask some questions. We'll start with Keith Bradshaw of the New York Times and board member.
Some might make the case the biggest beneficiary in the past decade of the current system and of the strength of the dollar has been China, in the sense that millions of jobs have moved to China, so many factories, so much technology, so many companies. If we were to follow through on what you suggest, then presumably the dollar would decline steeply. Maybe we see 3 renminbi to the dollar. You'd see what would probably be extensive job losses in China. It would be a huge political shock to the Chinese system. Is the world really ready, and in particular, are emerging markets ready for the kind of political shock that would be implied by some of what you suggest?
Well, yes, I think the world is ready because the world doesn't have any choice anymore. There was, as you mentioned, a joint interest in the past, and the growth was shared by the newcomers, by the emerging countries. Today it's different. Today the problem is whether growth is going to slow down everywhere in the world or whether we'll change the system. And I believe it's quite important today to disconnect the different parts of the world. And that means creating new engines, new power engines for development and for growth. I believe in this regard that the choice for China to give more importance to its domestic market and to domestic consumption is a very important element, because we cannot anymore rely on China exports and the US buying China's good without having to pay for it. I believe at the end of the day, this system is finished, because this system is dangerous. That's why I believe that we are at the end of a phase that may have been beneficiary to many countries, but it is not anymore the case, because the debt bubble is dangerous for the whole community, the whole world community. So really, we are in a new situation. It's because this new situation is unacceptable for many countries of the world. It is unfair. It is an element which is also quite dangerous. We know that wars do come from economic competition when there is unfairness. So that's why it is the world interest today to change the whole system, which is not adapted to the realities of today.
Questions from the audience over here? Tom Holland.
Oh, thank you. Tom Holland from the South China Morning Post. Monsieur de Villepin, politicians think credit rating agencies are very important. Investors don't. Certainly in this part of the world, no one's paid any attention to credit rating agencies since 1997, when they learned that ratings aren't to be trusted. So tell me, how does setting up another rating agency solve the problem? Surely that just makes it worse. I mean, governments in this part of the world want their own rating agencies to reflect their own political views, not to provide accurate ratings. If you want an accurate rating, simply look at the interest rate someone pays. That tells you everything you need to know about credit. What's the point?
Well, the point is very important. You can live very well with a broken watch, but you will live a lot better with a good watch. And it is not, and you are giving some arguments to my demonstration, it is not because the credit rating agency don't have any credit today that we can live without good credit rating agencies. If they have no credit, it's because they have not been doing their job. And in a world which is going to be a competition for credit, you see, in the past decades, credit was easy. So there was no reason to believe what any agency was saying. But now, credit is scarce. It's going to be difficult to get more credit. And the competition is going to be very difficult. So the question you may ask yourself, if you are Chinese, having to make decisions, whether on a government-based or a corporate base, you have to invest money. How are you going to invest in countries without having any advice? This is very difficult. Unless you live in the country for years, unless you know perfectly the question. If you are looking at the world through Beijing eyes or through the Qatar eyes, you need advice. And you cannot rely only on Western institutions to give you this kind of advice. And that's why we believe that if you want to have the real reality in hand, to be able to make choices adapted to the realities of today, you need to have agencies doing their business. That's why, in a way, more competition in this area is going to be good, because the competition for credit is going to be more and more difficult and severe.
Time for a few more questions.
Students.
Yes. We'll go to the students. I see one that I know quite well, Michelle.
The young generation is finding some concern on the matter.
I actually think credit agencies are pretty important because it affects funding costs, which affects a country's ability to put more investment into infrastructure or any other things that they want to build up. But I was just wondering, for your new UCRG, is there going to be a change in methodology, or like what's the difference between the Western ones?
Yes. Behind the idea of UCRG, there is the idea that the methodology that has been used until today is not adapted to the realities. If you take the way the credit rating agency, have been rating a country like Pakistan, they have not been understanding the reality of the economy of Pakistan. Overall, they were seeing a country in crisis and saying, okay, we give a bad marks to this country. But the reality is that many companies in Pakistan, the country as a whole, has gone through the crisis quite well. The same for the Russian banks. The Russian bank had gone very bad marks because of the old credit rating agencies. But the reality is that they've been doing fairly well during the crisis, as well as many other countries. So, and on the contrary, many countries that have been rated very well, beginning by the United States, have been facing very difficult the crisis of 2007, 2008, the same in Europe. So there is a tendency for these agencies to under-evaluate the new emerging world, and on the contrary, to overrate the old world. This must change, and this concern is behind UCRG, to have a more detailed methodology, to take into account some factors like cultural factors which are not taken into account by the old agencies.
Florence, and then we'll take one more from the floor.
Hello, I report for Le Monde, a French daily newspaper. I was wondering if the ideas that you've heard have already echoed, I mean, if you found echoes in some other big countries, and if so, which one? I mean, how supported are you in this new idea?
Well, as a matter of fact, I've been appointed as chairman of the advisory board just 24 hours ago. So it's a little short, even if the media are doing their job very well, to have any kind of reaction. But what I can say is that this is not only a new project. It's a very much weighted project, needed project. Everywhere I go, I was in Colombia a couple of days ago, in Russia a little before, there is a strong need from a different perspective, different views. You cannot judge the world through only the Washington eyes, which is not reflecting the reality of what's going on in Burma, what's going on in Pakistan, what's going on in South Africa. So this diversity of the world has not only to be taken into account by the government, it has to be also taken into account by the ones who are judging the world economy, judging the governments, and this is going to change completely the views we may have of some long-term tendency of the world economy.
We have time for one more question.
Jane Singer from Inside Fashion. I think you made a very interesting and compelling case for the need for change. I think it'd be very hard to argue with that. And yet what I'm wondering about is that it's often very difficult to get people to change, particularly those people who are profiting. And certainly those who are profiting from the current situation are very strong and very powerful. So in terms of getting to the point that you envision, which is a shift in power and currency and so forth, how do you see that unfolding? Do you see more of a revolutionary, crisis situation happening, or do you see a slow evolution? I mean, what kind of a timeline would you be seeing on that?
Of course, the risk of crisis, as I tried to show before, is very important, and everybody is aware that the world cannot continue this way. We can have a crisis in Washington from time to time, but We know that this is going to be next year and the year after. You know, the world cannot be in the hand of the Congress. This is not fair. So at the end of the day, we need to change the system. We need to change the system, and I believe that through cooperation and dialogue, the leaders of the world may be able to put in their agenda this as a top priority. And for a long period of time, there was the feeling that this was too much a hard work to start with. Now, of course, it's a hard work, but it's needed. There is an emergency, and we know that there are solutions. And that's exactly what I want to pledge for. In my position, I believe there are solutions. We should really discuss this solution. And of course, like always, this is important to debate about. And all this starts as debate in newspaper, debate among intellectuals, debate among economists, and then debate in governments. And at the end of the day, we change the policies. So it's a long way, but I believe that everybody knows that the current system is not a good one. And if I were the American government, and I'm not, if I were European governments, and I'm not, I will strongly believe that the world needs solution. You see, you cannot not be stricken by the fact that we have known a crisis in Syria for 2 years. 120,000 people died for nothing. And at the end of the day, we rediscover, after having all the big leaders of the world in the US, in Europe, saying, okay, we are going to have a military intervention, we discover that diplomacy can make things much better than force. Are we going to wait to have a next crisis with huge consequences on jobs, on people, to find new solutions? You know, this is a question of how rational is our societies, how rational is our world, and how much do we want to work for the better. So I believe these are ideas for the future. It will take time, but now we know that we cannot stay in the same situation than the one we are now.
I think we're going to need to end it on that note as it's 2 o'clock, but I'm sure you'll be around for a while to answer any further questions.
Of course, we can meet next month if you want.
Dominique de Villepin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We do have a small gift from the FCC to
thank
thank you for coming. And since we know you'll be back for family visits, we hope to have you in our pub for a drink at some point.
Good.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely afternoon.